Yesterday, I met with our worship team to plan the next year of preaching, believe it or not. We are always planning a year ahead. I have colleagues that are very envious of that. And it started with a conversation about beginning to lose our sense of hearing. Exactly. And I've noticed this too. As many of you know, I had a birthday this week. I turned the ripe old age of 42. And I have begun to notice that I don't hear as well as I used to. But I have an even bigger problem, if I'm being honest, which is that I sometimes just don't listen. It's not that I can't hear. It's that I just am not paying attention. I think that's most often because I am largely focused on talking, right? And again, yesterday there was a member of our group who kept reminding others of us to wait for others to finish speaking. I was so excited that I kept jumping in and talking too much. We are a culture that loves to talk. In fact, I just met with a scout this week as well who's getting ready to go for his Eagle Scout project. He's done his project, and then you have to do an interview with the board of the Scouts. And so he met with me because we were the recipients of his project. They have to meet with a representative of that organization, and I just was asking him some questions, and he was having a hard time answering. And at the end of our conversation, I said, you know, you're going to have to go in front of a group of people who are going to ask questions of you as well. What I want to encourage you to do is take your time, because I can tell that as I was asking questions today, you felt sort of put on the spot and you thought you had to speak immediately. You had to have an answer ready. And that's because we live in a culture that values the first person to speak, or the person that can speak the loudest. And so I said to him, take your time. I have learned that I appreciate people who give thoughtful responses better than those who always talk first. We love to talk. But I was trying to articulate for him what I would call kingdom principles, things that we as Christians are called to live by. The reality is, as I've said, that this world is about speaking first, and we, as kingdom people, would realize that it's more important to listen. We don't listen in our culture. We don't pay attention to nuance. We like to listen as little as possible so that we can pigeonhole someone where we think they are and make a judgment about them. And if our judgment is that we want to continue listening, then we may. But often our decision is that they are not worth listening to, and we turn off our ears. Or worse, we get ready to attack them because we've determined by listening just a little bit that they are worthy of attack. But listening, truly listening, is kingdom work. And we know that because we heard this long story, and maybe by now you're getting a hint as to why I also, on a Sunday when I'm going to encourage you to listen, I made you listen to 42 verses of Scripture. But it's also a story where we look to Jesus to see the kingdom principle of listening. He meets a woman and engages in good conversation with her and seeks to understand her. And the reality is that he doesn't have to. She's a Samaritan woman. I have talked frequently about the difference between the Jews and the Samaritans. And on top of that, she's a woman, and a man in his culture would never have needed to speak to a woman or listen to a woman. And in fact, they generally wouldn't have. But again, he's living kingdom principles, and so he sees that the world says it should be done one way, but Jesus, knowing and living in the kingdom, says, no, we behave differently. And so he listens not only to this person who is his enemy, according to the culture, but is also someone that he's not supposed to talk to because of her sex. he listens to her. And he does engage in conversation, but he is always asking questions of her to get her response. He's listening to her and seeking to understand what she needs so that he can respond appropriately. I'm really glad that Beth brought up the 7 habits. Why can't I say it for me, Beth? Right, the 5th habit. And who's the author of the book? Covey, yes. I hate to break it to him, though. I've got an earlier version. There's a prayer that actually we saw on our screen last week because we used a piece of music that the choir had sung previously called the Prayer of St. Francis. It's based off of a prayer called the Prayer of St. Francis. And in that, he says, "May we seek not so much to be understood as to understand." It sounds an awful lot like Covey's 5th principle, and yet was written in the, 16th century, I think. Specifically, you can see it up there. My tech people are way ahead of me. That's great. He says, "Lord, make me an instrument of your peace." And I really love this because I do think that these two things are tied closely together. The ability to build peace and the ability to listen to understand. Grant that I may not so much seek to be understood as to understand, and immediately after that, to be loved as to love. For it is in giving that we receive. And I think that this is true as well. When we seek to listen, when we give the gift of listening, what we will find is that it will open up others and they may be more willing to listen to us as well. If Jesus had dismissed this woman right out and yet had tried to say to her, "I am that bread that you are looking for. I am that living water that you are looking for," she would not have heard those words, but because he listens to her, she is open and receptive to receive the truth. And yet we continue in our ways, not listening to people and instead closing them off and attacking them. And then we expect them, if we are going to speak to them about what we believe, we expect that they should listen, even though we haven't. St. Francis wrote those words a long time ago, but we here at Goodrich United Methodist Church also wrote our own version of these words, seeking to go after understanding. We have a behavioral covenant. You were handed that on your way in. It's a piece of paper, 2 sides. On the front there, you'll see big letters, J-O-Y. It was composed a while ago when we were really focusing on joy, so that's why you see that. It's a good word always. It's the word that I will live by. Our faith brings us joy. Under O, you will see, and you can put this up on the screen as well, tech people, because I pulled it off to put up on the screen for those that are watching online and don't have a copy to look at right now. It says, "I will strive to practice active listening skills. I will repeat what I heard said to me to confirm the intent of the words spoken. I will accept corrections. I realize that it is more important that I focus on understanding the full situation than on focusing on speaking the most. I will remember that my perspective is not the only perspective, so I will listen to achieve understanding. This way I will have an open heart to consider suggestions so that new possibilities can be found." We wrote this behavioral covenant as part of our VCI process, and we are wanting to get it out in front of people so that we can say, this is who we are going to be as people. This is how we are going to live. And I say today that part of this is that we are going to live kingdom principles where we seek first to understand and then to be understood. Both of these things have that in common, and I had even forgotten the 7 habits, but I'm so grateful that Beth reminded me of that as well. This is a common theme to seek to understand rather than to be understood. It speaks kingdom wisdom. It speaks Christian understanding that is different than the world. And that's often how you will identify kingdom principles, is that they will be very different than the world. The world, again, wants us to speak first, most often loudest, so that we can get what we deserve, or we can have power, or we can get what's due to us. But the kingdom seeks to listen and understand, because in the kingdom, the other is more important. It's more important that they receive what they need and that they receive the truth. And again, people will never be ready to hear the truth if we have not listened to them first. And so again, that phrase from the prayer of St. Francis, it is in giving that we receive. I believe that this is true of listening. It is in listening that we then are able to be truly heard. And again, this sounds completely ridiculous, right? We think, no, I just need to speak more loudly or more clearly or something. We never stop and think, this person is not understanding me. Maybe I need to listen. But I can tell you that I can confidently say that I believe that it is more important that we listen to understand than it is to seek to be understood. And at the same time, I can tell you that I do not fully live out that truth yet. In fact, I think it's funny in some ways to stand up and talk for 20 minutes about listening, right? And it is the nature of kingdom principles and kingdom truths that in our inmost being we know that they are true, and yet they are hard to truly understand and live out. And so, that brings us to the title of this series. It's called Tough Love. You have another card. It'll remind you of the title. And I've already had someone ask, what's the image about? Well, the heart obviously is love, right? And we were going after the idea that tough love, and the next few weeks as we talk about tough love, it's often about including those people that we would normally leave on the outside. And so you'll notice that there's someone on the outside of the heart. They are in peril in some senses, and that may be very true. We may feel that way about people who are different than us, that they are truly in danger. And yet, there is this group of people who are clearly on the inside, and there's one who is seeking to help the one on the outside. Tough love is not what you normally would think of with tough love, which is, giving someone what they deserve so that they can learn their lesson. It's about understanding that God calls us to do things that are hard in order to love others. And so again, the prayer of St. Francis says that we are to love so that we can be loved. And we are to give tough love, I believe, to those who it is the hardest to love. It is one of the calls of the Christian life. And one of those things, as Beth so well named, is listening to people, especially people who are different than us or smell different than us. I like that she included that. We know this. We are a culture more divided than ever. Even within our own church, we face an impending schism. That's when a church divides over the things that we believe. And we refuse to listen to one another. We, though, as Christians, are called to be different kinds of people. It is so important that we be willing to listen, and not just to the people that are easy to listen to. And so while I say that we are divided, I want you to understand that there's a temptation often to say we are more divided than ever. We may be, in a sense, I feel like we're more divided than we were when I was a kid, although I was a kid and I didn't know anything. I still don't know anything, just so you know. But here's the thing. Using this story from the Gospel of John reminds us that we're not any more divided than they were in Jesus' time. This was the Samaritans and the Jews. This was the same as political divides that we have, or any other divide we may be tempted to say is bigger than anything else. These were people that refused to talk to one another and often harmed one another because their beliefs about religion were different. That's it. Their beliefs about religion were different. It sounds a little too familiar for my own tastes, as we do face division in our own church. Jesus knew what it was like to have people in the world who others said we should not talk to and listen to. But there has always been one solution, and that is to follow kingdom principles. And Jesus came to live among us to show us those ways. And so here he is, listening to understand so that he can share the truth. So, what do we do? Well, this is tough love, right? But on the other side of that, you're going to notice we made a little, I like to make jokes, you know. And some of them are funny, some of them are not. But this Tough Love series happens to start at the beginning of February, and guess what? The beginning of February is the most common time when people give up on their New Year's resolutions, okay? And so I decided that this would be sort of a two-pronged effort. One would be that we would make a new resolution if we've given up on our previous resolution, that we would make a new resolution in February to focus on being able to share love in tough ways with people. But I also call these cheat sheets because by now you are cheating on your resolution. That's what I know. So these are cheat sheets that you can carry with you. You're going to get one each week that gives you some suggestions of ways to do what it is that we're talking about in our Tough Love series that week. This week we're talking about being a better listener. And you'll be familiar with many of these, but cheat sheets are always helpful because even when we are familiar with them, we still probably forget to do them. So, some of them, again, are things that I immediately am like, oh yeah, I told you that I don't listen very well sometimes. What's my most common problem? Don't ask the staff if they're walking around here. Is that I'm distracted, right? They've learned to know when I'm actually listening and when I'm not, because you can tell when I'm distracted. And we distract ourselves in a multitude of ways these days. But in order to truly listen, we need to remove those distractions. That might be putting down a device that we often have with us, but it also can be, for me, sometimes simply tuning into the moment because my mind is just running. Yeah, I see people talking about that. Yeah. Sometimes we have to say, I am actually going to listen right now. And then it's always helpful to show that you're listening. I also get accused of this. One of the things I've learned as a pastor is that I really sometimes, you never know what you're going to hear, and so I've learned to put on my game face. Like, I'm not going to show any reaction because, again, and this can be important, right? If someone comes to you and says something truly terrible, you don't want to have them see the judgment on your face. And so the game face can be important, but it's important that they know that you're listening as well. And so that can be nodding or saying, right? And then as we say in our behavioral covenant, reflective listening is important, saying, this is what I heard you saying. This can really help for that piece of listening that we talk about, which is understanding. You know, it's so that you can say, am I actually understanding you? And the person has the opportunity then to say, oh, no, I must have not said it very well. Let me try again to communicate to you so that you understand. It also shows that you have a real desire to understand, right? Rather than just saying, yep, heard you, and walking off, you are showing them that you're actually trying to understand. This is really important as well. Don't be thinking about what you're going to say next. This is our biggest temptation. And I'll be honest, a lot of it comes out of sort of the societal fear of silence, right? We think, I've got to be ready to say something, because if I'm just silent, who knows what they'll think? But as I encourage that scout, it's important to understand that thoughtful answers are really good. So just listen and then respond. And then they give a percentage. I pulled this off of information about how to listen well. And it's, we would think, a conversation is 50-50, right? We're sharing equal parts. They say, no, I'll try to listen 75% of the time and only speak 25% of the time. This would be really hard for a lot of us, I think, right? And so it's a really good place to aim for, to say, I'm going to listen more. Roger Gill's not here today, but one of his favorite things is to point out that we have 2 ears and 1 mouth, right? And that's what that 75% is to remind you that God built us this way for a reason, right? Use your ears. And then be aware of body language. Again, I've talked about faces, but there are other ways in which, if someone comes up to you and says, do you have a minute to talk? And you say, yep, I do. They're going to think, no, you don't, right? We have to be aware of how we look to people. Believe it or not, it's not just about your ears, although that's a useful way to say, focus on your ears, not on your mouth. You actually have to listen completely. Don't interrupt. That was my problem yesterday. But instead, wait for an opening. I know that with some people, that can be really hard. You think, when am I going to get an opening to respond? That may be an invitation to pause, be less distracted, and to really listen more. They must have some reason that they are needing to talk so much. And then one last thing you can do that I would invite you to do this week, if you want to, is ask people, how do you think I am as a listener? And be honest, right? And tell them that you're going to listen, because maybe if you're not a great listener, they feel like, oh, well, you're not actually going to listen to what I'm going to say to you, right? But you can ask people, how am I as a listener? And see what they say, and they may be able to give you steps that you could work on, right? Spouses are really good for that if you have a spouse. If you have good friends, friends will be honest with you. Ask your friends. There are people that will tell you the truth. And that's what we can do. You can take this with you this week and use it as your cheat sheet to listen and use the tools. But more importantly, make the intention to be listening, because that is really the kingdom principle here. This is the fine-tuning, the things that we gave you on the cheat sheet of how to listen. But the reality is that the primary thing this Sunday to understand about tough love is that we live in a world that is focused on speaking. But the kingdom principle, the way to live as Jesus would have us live, is to be people who listen. And it can be tough. I know that. It is hard to listen to people. I mean, that was the very first thing that was said in the children's time today. It's hard to listen about a topic that you don't want to listen about, either because you are convinced the person is wrong or whatever. Jesus sits there, and this woman, explains the history of the Samaritans. You guys believe that we can only worship in Jerusalem. It's not like Jesus doesn't know this, right? But he listens and then responds. Don't just listen when you're supposed to or when you like to. Seek to listen even when it's hard. Put yourself in a place to listen. That's the last thing I was going to say about Jesus, is that, so this is a funny scripture. You wouldn't know it, and if you're one of those people that says, well, the scripture says it, what it says in the beginning, if you pay attention, is it says he had to go through Samaria, which is a weird thing to say because Jews never had to go through Samaria. They went around Samaria because they hated the Samaritans so bad that they didn't want to step foot in that area. The reason it says Jesus had to is that Jesus wanted to be in a place to listen. And so the had to isn't about, we often hear it as like, well, it's the most direct route. Well, yeah, that may be true, but that's not the reason Jesus had to be there. Jesus had to be there because he knew he was going to meet this woman and he wanted to listen to her. And that's a really powerful statement. Be willing to put yourself in a place where you can listen this week. And then be ready to listen even beyond where you're normally willing to, even to the person that you normally tune out. Because we are called to be people who give tough love, who pull people into the heart of God when they are on the outside and include them even when we are convinced that they must be something other than we are. It's tough work to do, but it's the work of the kingdom. Amen.